Hello, I'm Professor Coleman, and I'll be teaching Journalism 181 this spring. You might be wondering why I'm communicating with you via this video instead of the normal means of walking into the classroom on the first day and introducing myself and talking about the class. The reason is there's some information you really need before the first day of class. This video and the others that accompany it will provide that information. Let's start here. The College of Journalism has a grammar requirement. All journalism majors must demonstrate that they have a practical knowledge of grammar and of mechanical conventions as used in journalistic writing. The term mechanical conventions is generally used to refer to things like punctuation, spelling, capitalization, and so on. There are two ways to meet this requirement. One is to earn a passing grade, a C- or better, in Journalism 181. The other is to score 80% or better on a diagnostic test. The videos will give you information about what will be on the test, how to study, and what the test procedures will be. Please watch all of them. Now let's back up a minute though. Why does there even have to be a grammar requirement? Well, briefly, since about the 1970s, there's been a decline in formal grammar teaching in kindergarten through 12th grade. Now, I don't think this is a terribly bad thing. The way that grammar was taught was often not very good, and it often left people with some fairly heavy-duty writer's block because you were expected to produce grammatically perfect and grammatically sophisticated sentences right off the bat. Now, I think the focus is a bit more on free writing. Get it down, revise it later, and I think that's actually better. However, the pendulum does often swing a little bit too far, and many schools have discontinued or greatly reduced any form of instruction in grammar. The result is that our journalism majors they remain competent, intuitive writers. Nobody's even going to think about going into journalism unless they're very comfortable with writing. But they're often unaware of the conventions of standard edited formal journalistic English, the kind of thing that you have to learn. You can't acquire it intuitively by doing a lot of writing or a lot of reading. Now, why is it important to know these conventions? Why is a good knowledge of grammar that important? Well, when you make a grammatical error, one of two things can happen. The first is that you can mislead your readers, and for a journalist, that's a serious matter. The second is that your readers will spot the error and won't be misled, but they will be distracted. In other words, you're not doing your job because your readers aren't getting the story. Instead, they're paying attention to your writing and specifically to your mistakes, and that's unprofessional. Let's look at some examples. Here are two sentences I stole, with permission, from a colleague who teaches journalism at the University of Maryland. He's also a working journalist, by the way. You'll notice that the difference between them is just the placement of a pair of commas. But in terms of meaning, there's a very great difference, and if you don't get your commas right, you'll end up saying something you didn't mean to say. The first sentence, Maryland students who riot after games are often drunk, is about just those University of Maryland students who riot after games. It doesn't say anything about the others. It predicates drunkenness of just the students who riot after games. The second sentence is like the first, but the subordinate clause, who riot after games, is set off by commas. That makes it a non-restrictive, in traditional terms, or in the terms preferred by the AP style book, non-essential relative clause. Now, to call something a non-essential relative clause doesn't mean the information isn't important. It means it is not essential to helping the reader figure out what group of people is being talked about. So the second sentence, Maryland students who riot after games are often drunk, is about all University of Maryland students. It says they are often drunk, and, by the way, they riot after games. Now, those are two very different sentences, but the difference between them seems to be a small one in terms of punctuation. It's just a matter of the placement of a couple of commas. Let's take a look at another example. This is a headline from the Diamondback. Increase in crimes worry neighborhood businesses. Now, if you just say that, it sounds okay, but let's look at it a bit more closely. Increase is the subject. That's singular. The verb is worry, but that's a plural verb. Obviously, the headline is incorrect. The way to correct it would be to make worry singular. The increase worries neighborhood businesses. You can see how this happened, by the way. Presumably the headline writer saw crimes worry, with worry next to crimes, and thought worry should agree with crimes. But it doesn't, of course. Crimes is the object of the preposition in. It's a noun in a prepositional phrase, and it will have no effect on the verb. Again, the subject, the simple subject, is increase. The verb has to agree with increase. Let's look at another example. This one's from the Washington Post. Such sentiments have caused a stir at his evangelical Christian church. They also caused a public argument with his wife, an Army reservist who spent 5 months in Iraq at a neighborhood birthday party. Now, this isn't going to mislead anyone. We know she didn't spend 5 months in Iraq at a neighborhood birthday party. But the prepositional phrase, at a neighborhood birthday party, which apparently modifies a public argument with his wife, is in the wrong place. It's a misplaced modifier. Now, even though we know what the writer probably meant, we've gotten distracted, and the writer herself has gotten in the way of the story that she was trying to tell. Let's look at another example. This is a piece of public relations writing from the Ohio State University website. Wasps, yellow jackets, and hornets have a lance-like stinger without barbs and can sting repeatedly. They should be brushed off the victim's skin promptly with deliberate movements, then quietly and immediately leave the area. Here's the problem. Quietly and immediately leave the area is pretty clearly an instruction to the people who either have been stung or fear they may be stung because they've noticed the presence of the wasps, yellow jackets, or hornets. The problem is that the subject of the second sentence is they, pretty clearly referring back to the wasps, yellow jackets, and hornets that are the subject of the first sentence. But they is not the subject of quietly and immediately leave the area. You can see how this happened. The second sentence is actually 2 sentences, with the subject of the second one missing. So they should be brushed off the victim's skin promptly with deliberate movements, then the victim or people should quietly and immediately leave the area. Maybe the first part of the second sentence was originally in the active voice, something like you should brush them off your skin promptly with deliberate movements, and then was put into the passive because it works better that way. Work through it yourself and you can see why they should be brushed off the victim's skin promptly with deliberate movements is better than brush them off your skin promptly with deliberate movements. But you still have the problem that quietly and immediately leave the area does not go with they. One more example. Militias were operating in the area. He denied any link to U.S. forces. Now the problem here is the ambiguity of the word to. It could mean he told the militias he had no link to U.S. forces. Or the sentence could mean he told U.S. forces he had no link to the militias. He denied to U.S. forces any link to the militias. And that would be an awkward sentence. You wouldn't want to say it that way. Now, it's easy enough to laugh at these examples. Bear in mind, though, that each one was written by someone who had been assigned to that job, and in 2 cases they were actually professional writers who wrote their segments, presumably double-checked them, sent them to an editor who okayed them, and they went up on the website or into the newspaper. In other words, it's easy to make mistakes. Especially because if you're the writer, you know what you meant to say. And remember that grammar is important because your errors can either mislead your readers or they can distract your readers. So that brings us back to the question of why there is Journalism 181. The problem is students graduating with degrees in journalism but without adequate competence in grammar is something that has been a concern for faculty in colleges of journalism and for professional journalists for some time. What the Philip Merrill College of Journalism at the University of Maryland has decided to do is to require competence in practical grammar of all of its graduates. In fact, it requires it of those who enter the program. And to provide training for those who need it in order to achieve that level of competence. And that is what Journalism 181 is meant to do. It is a 1-credit course that meets for an hour once weekly and provides a review of practical journalistic grammar. We won't be looking at poetry, plays, fiction, or anything like that. But what about those who did have a good grounding in grammar? Well, for those students, the requirement can be fulfilled by a diagnostic test. If you achieve a score of 80% or better, you don't have to take the course at all. In the next set of videos, I'll talk about what will be on the diagnostic and how to study for it, and what the test procedures will be.